Hey guys, welcome to the Clone Accelerator program. In today's topic, we're going to talk about various camera equipments that we're going to, show you in terms of what you can use for creating your very own clones. So, what to expect from this presentation? I'm going to go over various types of cameras, whether they're going to be full frame versus crop sensors. They each have, their pros and cons, right? So, I'm going to walk over a couple of things in terms of that. And then again, the pricing, the options, and then again, what's my take on each one of those cameras, right? So moving on to the first thing, when it comes to any camera, there's basically a term that you're probably going to hear. So like if many of you have bought any camera in past, you have heard the term called full frame versus crop sensor. They're both good. They both have their benefits in terms of, again, if you were to get the crop sensor camera, they're going to not cost you arm and a leg, but you'll still be able to get a good cinematic style videos, right? Whereas the full frame, it's going to be just that next level, right? So again, you get to make a decision whether you want a full frame versus crop sensors. In past, I have had used both of them for creating Onyx avatars. So I have used the crop sensors versus the full frame. Again, the quality difference it's gonna make in terms of the look and feel of the avatar, right? So moving on to the full frame, right? So let's talk about the full frame a little bit more and what are the benefits of it. So again, it's a larger sensor size, which means it will work under great low light performance, right? Also, it's gonna have a wider dynamic range, so your colors are gonna look great. Not just the foreground, but like foreground, background, and everything the whole image comes out to be, right? And basically the images are much more cleaner even at the higher ISO. So again, when you're doing your clone, it's a decision that you get to make, right? Like, do I wanna stick to the full frame or do you wanna go the crop sensor, right? So now with the full frame, you also get a shallow depth of field, which just means your background can have a nicer bokeh, especially for the portraits, right? Now, as you guys know, for this very clone, we are trying to achieve that effect, like we have a nicer bokeh in the background. So one of the things that when I film for Onyx or even one of our clients, I try to get the bokeh as much as possible at like certain aperture. Now aperture is a term that lets me decide how much of a bokeh I want in the background. So sometimes I do 1.8 to 2.8 to get a nicer bokeh, or sometimes I even do 5.6 to get the green screens, to get green screen images or the videos, right? So again, it's a decision that you get to make as a person, like what do you want? But I'm just kind of going over what's possible with the full frame. Now again, the cameras are much bigger, they're heavier, and they're more expensive, right? So again, that's pretty much, it's not a con, but it's basically, it lets you, more sturdiness in terms of the camera. When you put it on a tripod, it doesn't shake a lot. So there's just a lot of helpful things when it comes to full frame cameras. Whereas the other one, if we go into the details, much smaller sensor size. So again, what's gonna happen, let's say you had a 35 millimeter angle, right? So most of Onyx filming that I do, I either do it on 35 or 85. For most of his clone stuff, I've been doing it on 85. But if you bought a crop sensor camera, literally your 85 will be, so if you like do it the 1.5x, that literally becomes like you're adding another 42 millimeter to it. What is 44 millimeter when it comes to lenses? Is basically how wide or zoom it is, right? So you already begin with 85 millimeter lens, and now you're adding like another 45 millimeter on top of that. That it is so close now from the distance that you're filming or photographing. So again, crop sensor is gonna not let you see based on the lens that you have. It's gonna literally 1.5x or 1.6x depending on what brand of cameras that you're buying. Again, they're more compact, they're more affordable, and then they have a deeper depth of field, but it's harder to get extreme background blur, right? So again, if you're looking for nicer bokeh and nicer, like a clean image with, persons more visible versus the background is like literally blurred, then you really want to go with the full frame versus the crop sensor. It's not going to give you all that. It's a decision you get to make based on what your needs are, right? So moving on to the next, these are the different focal lenses. As I talked about for Onyx, I use 85 millimeter, which is literally considered as a portrait lens in a world of photography or cinematography. There are other ones too, like 105 or 135, but mainly 85 is like considered as a portrait lens. That's why that is my go-to lens when it comes to doing the portraits. Now, many of you are gonna say, hey, Parvak, we don't have a lot of space in the room where I have enough distance to film, right? So when you use 85 millimeter, your subject is gonna be a little further from your camera. They're not gonna be as close. So let's say many of you don't have a lot of space in your room, well then you can go with the 50 millimeter. So that's the lens choice that you get to make. Now again, I have yet to go over all the lenses or all the cameras and all the different kind of particular types of camera you can have. And based on that, this can change, right? Now you see at the bottom I said 16 to 35 millimeter, which is a wide angle, right? So let's say you want to film a walking avatar, or you want to handheld film a walking avatar. Well, in that case, you're going to need a wider lens, because as you guys know, it's harder to keep the camera steady when you're especially you zoomed in. So again, it's one of the techniques that I use, like whenever I'm doing any handheld cinematography, I'm literally going after the 16-35. So again, that's just the different lens choices you can have. Some of you may already have these lenses, some of you may already have the camera kits, and this is literally either the part of it or something you would want to add to it. Now, there's so many different types of lenses and lens choices that you have based on each one of the brands that you have the cameras of, right? So Canon makes like four different types of 85. Nikon, I personally used a lot, so they make between 2 to 3, right? Depending on what camera you have, you're gonna select a lens based on what it's gonna fit your camera, right? So let's say you're buying an 85 millimeter for your Sony, well, make sure the lens mount has to be Sony mount. So like, don't accidentally get the Nikon or the Canon, because same lenses, like different brands of lenses are available for each one of those camera brands, right? So you just wanna make sure of that. So now, before I jump into what cameras options that you have, always remember that camera or like any photos or any videos are based on these three things, right? So it's an exposure triangle is what it's called. It's an ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. So with the combination of three, you can have best looking footage based on what you're using, right? Now, when I film, again, before I even go into the details, the exposure triangle basically explains how bright or dark your video and photo is going to look like, right? So three controls that you have on any of the cameras: the ISO, shutter speed, and the aperture. Literally each three of those can control how bright or dark your video is going to look like. So depending on what your goal is, you're going to change the settings on each one of them. Based on the lighting that I showed you guys last time, and I've been filming with Onyx for such a long time that I actually have remember all the settings. So when I'm on a podcast set with him, literally like my ISO is at 100. Because I have an ample amount of light, I do not need to take my ISO any further than 100 ISO. Why? Because I've got a decent amount of light. So then why should I take my ISO and make my image noisy? Now, second is the shutter speed. So whenever I'm doing his videos, my shutter speed is always 160. And after this slide, I'm gonna cover why I do shutter speed at 160 compared to all the other ones. Like literally you can get the same feel and look at lower shutter speed. So now moving on to the aperture, right? So aperture has completely to do with the background blur and the cinematic look you're gonna get. So how many of you guys have actually seen great movies where you literally have the background is completely blurred, you can't even make it out what it's out there, literally your focus is on the person? So you can achieve that effect. Now, is that needed for creating clones? It's a decision that you get to make. I would say do it, and it has its pros and cons, right? Now, when your subject is not very well lit, I would actually have you avoid, because sometimes what people will do, well, I don't have enough light, so let me just make my background blur by opening the aperture so that I get more light and my video is going to look better. Then now, of course, you can do that, but then what you're doing to your scene is you're like, hey, I'm not adding the light, but then let me just open up the aperture, and my ISO and the shutter speed, and still get the same, like a best footage. Well, it's not going to be great for HeyGen. So what HeyGen needs is the proper lighting, which I covered that in the video, the previous videos. And then based on that lighting, your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO needs to be at very minimum. So whenever I film, the first thing is I start with the lighting. I do enough light that I do not need to do more of the ISO, because ISO can create a lot of noise, right? So I always say between 100 and 640. Now, depending on what camera you're using, you're gonna be at different settings between the range of 100 and 640, right? Some of the camera may not have 640 and they directly jump onto the 800. So it all depends on what brands of cameras you have, but it's pretty standard in terms of the how frequent that number moves in terms of the number, actual number. So again, why need this, right? So it connects to the phone apps, cameras, and lenses into the one simple concept. Uh, Basically, one line takeaway is the brightness, motion, and background blur, right? So again, I think I made a mistake on this sheet. This is why do I need this? Because it connects to the phone apps. I think it's from my different presentation, so you can literally disregard this. Why need this? So you can literally can take this part out. But one line takeaway in terms of what the exposure triangle is: brightness, motion, and the background blur, right? So it's controlled by these three settings. So let's move on to the ISO. As you guys can see this image, look at the ISO. The one that says 00, it's a cutout here, it should be 100. So at 100 ISO, although the image is blurred, look at the noise, right? So the whole goal is to actually show you the noise. That is why this very image was photographed in out of focus, so you can actually read the noise, right? So as I move from 100 to 12,000, you see how this noise is changing, like how bad it's looked. So anything past 800, or I would even say 640 on my cameras that I have, which are Nikons and Sony, I tend to not go past 400. So if you're at 400 ISO and if you still think your your visuals are darker, then go ahead and lock your app camera at 400. Now either try to add more light, or you can compensate by going into the aperture. And aperture, the way it works, and I'm going to explain you on the next spreadsheet. Basically, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. It's all three of them. You can actually control the way you want your camera footage to look, or the way you actually control how your scene is going to look, right? So let's move on to the ISO. Let's move on to the app stop, where we can talk about different app stop. Now, what app stop does? Watch closely to my right. So whenever I film with our guest or whoever I'm doing the clone for, basically we can start from 1.4, go all the way to 22, right? Now, when you're gonna do 22, your lens aperture is closed, means it's gonna need an insane amount of lighting that needs to come through. So you need to do insane amount of lighting on your subject, whether it's a foreground or background, to achieve both of the things completely in focus. So your foreground is in focus and your background is in focus. Most of the time, I get away with doing 5.6 on a green screen. So whenever I do green screens, I tend to stay with the 5.6. I do decent light, so my ISO is always 100 or 125. And then I'm never using the 1.4. The reason I do not use 1.4, especially on green screen, it gives you this weird edges when you do 1.4. It literally tries to do the bokeh. Now, when you try to isolate that green screen to swap the background, basically what's going to happen to your hair, it's going to look very like fuzzy. So therefore, ideal scenario for green screen is going to be your f8 aperture and 5.6. Other than that, for other sets, it's all subjective in terms of how much of bokeh you want, right? So if you want an extreme bokeh, you can go 1.4. I generally don't like to go 1.4 because when you do that level of bokeh, sometimes HeyGen does have issues with creating, getting the clones out better. So my ideal range is between 2 and 2.8 for the nicer bokeh. For green screen, I stay between 5.6 and 8. Now, you guys can actually YouTube it more in terms of what app stop is, watch more videos, so it can actually explain to you. But in today's training, I'm kind of like focused on, what app stop is, what ISO is, how it can help you when creating your clone. So I'm going at the very high level, details in terms of what they are. So again, let's move to the shutter speed, right? Now, shutter speed, as you guys can know, when a lot of photographers, when they actually photograph sports, as you can see in the image, we got a moving figure here, right? So if ideally, when you either photograph or videotape, your shutter speed is most likely at 125. Now, I know it's not included in here, but with my experience in photography, 125 is an ideal position where you're gonna be able to, either videotape or even photograph. With videotaping, I think people actually tend to even keep 60 because most of the time the camera's on a tripod, so it's not gonna move or shake. So 60 is where people start, but I don't like it. The reason I don't like it, because if we look at down here, it says, strictly speaking, shutter speed does not directly control color. Its primary purpose is to regulate exposure duration and the motion blur. However, it can influence the color quality and accuracy through several indirect side effects, right? So again, you can videotape your videos at 30 frames per second. That's not gonna be an issue. But what's gonna happen, compare your same scene 30 versus 160 or 30 versus 60 versus 125 versus 160. See the difference it makes in terms of the quality, in terms of the details, and in terms of the color that it can bring it to you. So your video is not gonna look washed out at 160 compared to what it will look at 30 shutter speed, right? So again, when you guys are buying these cameras, just make sure that you're using correct settings in here, right? My ideal settings are this. I like to keep it at 160 with, if you're on a green screen, maybe 5.6 aperture, or if you're on a regular scene, you can do 2 to 2.8. So I would actually lock those in first before I even do my lighting, because then what happens, once you're happy with your camera settings, well, now you can actually increase or decrease the light. Now, how can you increase or decrease the light? Either whatever lights that you're using that I went over with the last video, you can either pull the power up, and if your power up is all the way, then you can even bring the lights closer to the subject. So again, two different methods of increasing the power. Either bring the lights closer to the subject or increase the power of it. So that's what you can do. So next part, we're going to talk about the frame rate, right? So why frame rate and resolution is very important. Now, as you guys can see, whenever you're producing any videos in HeyGen, now I don't know if you guys ever tried the HeyGen before you're actually watching this video or after. Frame rates are very important, and I always film everything at 60 frames per second, right? So you get a smooth motion. You don't look like it's a normal footage. Now in movies they use a 24 frames per second because of the cinematic look. But again, ideally for what we're doing, I think technically we should be using a 60 frame per second, right? Now many of you guys are gonna ask like, hey, but HeyGen doesn't allow you to export those frames, right? Well, what we want to do is we want to give HeyGen as much as possible. So with 60 frames, you're giving them a lot of pixels and a lot amount of information, right? Instead of the 24 frames per second. So you're giving them more than what you require. So then based on that, they actually tend to learn a little bit better. So again, the smooth motion actually helps us with the gesture, or the slow motion actually helps us with the gesture too, right? Now technically slow motion is very incorrect here. Why do I say that, right? Because smooth motion you get at the 60 frame. However, the slow motion happens at 120 frames per second, which is a totally different territory. We're not even going to talk about that here because it has nothing to do with HeyGen. So next up, let's talk about the frame rate, right? So why is frame rate very important? Well, the reason why frame rate is important because it's going to dictate how your footage is going to look like, whether it's going to look like a smooth motion or it's going to look like a normal or cinematic look. Now, go ahead and try doing the 24 and 30 frames per second. It's not a problem at all. I personally like doing everything in 60 frames per second, right? Because it gives me very smooth motion, hence allowing me to capture all those gestures and all those details at the extreme level, which basically then makes it into the HeyGen, and then HeyGen is able to provide you with a better avatar. Again, resolution, right? Resolution. Some of you are familiar with the 1080 versus 4K. Which one do you want to film? Well, if your camera allows only 1080, then go ahead and use the 1080. 4K is an ideal resolution that I would like to get. The reason I do that is if you get 4K resolution and you upload inside HeyGen, it has a lot more details that it can capture, hence allowing you to get a better, your better clone. So I do 4K. Even if I'm going to export in 1080 out of HeyGen, I would still actually ask you to capture all of your videos in 4K. It's going to make a day and a night difference by doing so. So again, why beginners need this? Because they stop guessing the settings and they start choosing intentionally. So again, when I were like, hey, it's 24 versus 60, it's completely subjective, but the 60 just gives you a better, better results overall. So moving on to what kind of camera should we be paying, right? So many of you guys are like, hey, I'm on a very strict, tighter budget. I don't want to spend a lot of money in terms of, buying the camera and having the tripods and that sort of thing, right? So what I really suggest you guys do is get a Blackmagic camera app, which is completely free. You're not even paying any subscriptions or anything. And what it does, it actually allows you to, as you can see on my image, literally you got a different controls here. So if you have a camera app, it doesn't have a lot of controls that you're going to find in this app. So one thing it's going to do, it's going to give you a lot of controls. And remember, I talked about the frame rate. I talked about the different lens composition. I talked about the shutter speed. I talked about the App Stop, which is also known as an Iris, right? So some of the apps actually use Iris as a way to say the App Stop, but App Stop and Iris is literally the same thing. And then guess what? You also have your ISO. Now, a lot of the clone that I filmed, those were rocking shot. I tend to use Black Camera Magic app also for those. So you can actually put these cameras on a gimbal, and you can literally capture your walking avatars using the phone. Or you can even put your gimbal on a tripod or a little stand, like a tabletop stand, and you literally have the camera facing you, or actually ask somebody else to record it for you. They can literally capture your videos with somewhat of a lighting, and then literally you can have the good looking avatar just by using the phone. So again, this is the cheaper option because you don't have to go through buying a bunch of cameras, lenses, and adding a lot of stuff to your portfolio in terms of what do you need. So let's move on to the second option, right? So this is an entry level camera. I have personally used the previous gen version of the Sony ZV-1 in past. I feel that it's a pretty decent camera, and it comes with a built-in 16-35 millimeter lens, and it comes at the cost of $598, right? Now, when you go into professional territory, well, with $598, you can't even buy a lens, right? So again, Sony, this particular camera is such a great, and look, the screen even flips, right? So let's say if you were to do your own filming, you can literally see what you're recording on the camera. So all you need is a little tripod, this camera, and you are good to go. I think it even has a built-in microphone too. I don't remember if it does or not, but I think back in the days I remember I used to use custom microphones, but you can literally slap like any microphone on here and still able to get a great audio, right? Now, as long as you're in a quiet environment, even the audio from this can actually help you. And again, go and watch my audio equipment training, right? In there, I said, even if no matter what audio you're using or audio equipment that you're using, you're able to connect that with your Sony camera or any other professional devices. So now let's move into the medium budget cameras. So here you got two options, right, that I'm giving you. You can either go for the Canon EOS. And now, before I forgot to say one thing. This entry-level budget camera, Sony, it's not a full-frame camera, right? So again, remember those things, right? It's not going to give you great bokeh. It's going to give you good quality, but it's not going to give you great bokeh, and you're going to be limited by certain quality, right? But when you go into the medium budget cameras, you got this full frame Canon EOS RP, which is a mirrorless camera, and it's $1,099, right? And it does come with, I think there are kits available, so you can actually choose the lenses. This one is a 24 by 105. So it's pretty much giving you remember that 85 millimeter I talked about, and because it's a full frame, if you are at 85, it's gonna keep it at 85. It's not gonna 1.5x it. So remember, this is a great, so those who actually likes Canon, this is a great one that you can have. Or if you have a little higher budget, you can go with this particular model, which is, Sony A7 III. And what Sony A7 III is gonna let you do is gonna allow you to capture, better videos. Of course, at that price point, you're now entering into professional category. Although sometimes these cameras are considered as a semi-professional, but like the amount of quality nowadays you can get out of the camera is such an insane that you can actually use this camera and still get a good cinematic quality. So again, your lens is going to be very subjective, right? Whether you go for 55 or 85. I believe this one, probably one that comes as a kit, is between, I think it's like almost like a 35. Let me see. Let me take a look here. I think it is a 35 millimeter lens. So you can definitely use that. Also comes with the autofocus, so you're not doing a manual focus. So again, this is a great lens that you can use, and with that price, like, you can literally get a good amount of footage out of it. Okay, so now let's move on to the high-end professional camera, right? So this is a 8K camera, which is Sony A1. I think they even have a A1 II now, which is what we also use for doing a lot of R&D for ONIC. But this Sony A1 is very competitive in terms of the quality, look, and feel of what we're getting right now. Now it comes at a very hefty price, right? It's $8,600 with the 2470 G Master Sony lens, and again with the top of the line Sony A1 DSLR, right? So, and again, these are all mirrorless cameras, so they're gonna be very lightweight, easy to use, very compact. So again, now to support all these cameras, well, of course you need a tripod, right? So I've been researching a lot of tripods because I use a lot of professional grade tripods. Like those are north of $400-500 all the way up to like $2,000. So I didn't want to give you guys a higher level model here just yet. But this newer budget tripod is good enough. So let's say you bought this Canon EOS RP, right? $1,099. Then you just added another $79 tripod, right? This is all you need to get your videos done. Like, you don't need fancy tripods. You don't need fancy cameras. Like, with literally this tripod and this camera right here, you can still get your job done. Or you even bought this camera, which is Sony ZV-1, and then you went after this tripod. Well, again, your kit is literally done in $700, right? So again, feel free to go through each one of these cameras online, study their specs. Even if you have a lot of questions, you can just YouTube it about each camera or the tripod and see how other people have reviewed it, right? So these are just the basic ones I wanted to give you. Now for the tripod, let's say if you guys bought this high-end model, then I really don't want you to get this budget tripod because, again, it's going to be able to support it, but at the same time, your lens is going to be heavier, your camera is going to be heavier. So then I would rather have you go into the professional tripod, which on its own is about $679, right? Now, they have a lot of other tripods that actually starts at $1,000, $1,200, $2,000, $3,000. Do you need them? No. But if you are in a business of doing cinematography, and let's say you have a various types of camera where your payload for the camera is anywhere between 10 pound to 50 pound, you're going to need a tripod based on that. So again, go through each one of these tripods that I gave you, see which one fits your need, what's your budget, what do you want to spend. It's very subjective. You're going to have people that are going to buy Canon camera and then they're going to buy a cheaper tripod and they're still going to be able to get the better quality out there. It's all about dialing your lighting, your audio, and literally your scene, right? The very place where you're going to actually film this video. So again, I showed you guys a lot of options. Feel free to watch a lot of other videos of these same products and try to get a gauge of it before you purchase. Even most of the companies will even allow you to, for example, like B&H, right? You can literally buy stuff from there, kind of like try it, test it, see if it works. If it doesn't work, try to move on to the next camera. Like I would say, go ahead and start with this one. If you're not happy with the quality, and hey, you want more out of your clone, then go with the medium budget camera. Just call them, let them know, hey, you made a change of mind. You didn't want this camera. You want to move it to a little better one. And they do have a good return policy, right? Now, don't try to test like I do it, right? So whenever I test it, I actually rent cameras to do that. I don't buy it and return it. But that's also another great thing you can do. You can actually go to lensrentals.com. So if you don't want to buy the camera, another option that you have is you can actually even rent the camera. So what I do, I go to lensrentals.com, which is in US, and depending on what country or region you're from, you might have other local stores where you can actually rent the cameras from. Let's say you don't want to own this $8,600 cameras. Why don't you rent it for 3 days? Along with the tripod. Now you're not going to have the same tripod from them, but they may have a similar tripod that you can rent and literally get the same thing done. Now, only thing you'll have to do is you'll have to plan your shoot in such a way so that your shoot happens over a period of 2 days. You're literally done capturing all of your footage. And then again, because it's a rental, now you're returning it, and you only need to film clones once in a while. It's not like you're doing it every single day, right? So just remember, whatever camera, lens, or whatever you use, just make sure you know inside out. Again, this is all I wanted to capture in terms of what cameras to buy. Again, each one of these cameras have different settings. There's a lot. There are plenty of videos available. Depending on whatever model you have, there's plenty of videos available online, and you can literally go through each one of them. But again, remember, when I talked about, and I'm going to go back here, when I talked about the ISO, the f-stop, and the shutter speed, my go-to ISOs between 100 and 400 or even worse 600. I do not tend to go more than that, especially for the clone. F-stop, I try to stay at 5.6 for the green screen, or my regular footage is between aperture 2 and 2.8. I don't even, if I have a great lens which allows me to go to 1.4 aperture, I don't even do that. Like I try to stay at 2. 2 is good enough for me. You can do more bokeh, but I do not recommend extreme level of bokeh for at least for the HN. And then your shutter speed are going to be at 160. Don't try to go 200, 250, 500. Of course, you can do so if you're outdoor. But then outdoor, if you try to go more in terms of shutter speed, like 500 to cut the light, like basically outside you have a sun, right? So you're trying to cut the light down. Some people try to do that by going 500 shutter speed or 1000 shutter speeds. Don't do that. There are a lot of natural, like ND filters out there you can use, which helps you cut the light without even going higher in the shutter speed. So use that. You can even watch more videos about ND filters, and you can kind of get a gauge of it, what they are. For those who are professional photographers, cinematographers, you guys already know what I'm talking about. So again, use of ND filters is such a great tool for you to still get what you want without having to compromise the look and feel of your scenes. And then frame rates I talked about, just to recap, and then the iPhone option is a free, so it's a free app. Entry-level budget camera, medium budget camera, there are two options right there for you. Now, some of you are like, hey, I want to use a Nikon. I don't like Canon or Sony. Well, you have a Nikon, Fuji. There are so many other similar models available. Like when it comes to Nikon, I can guarantee you, like you can actually use Z6 II, which I believe is a $1,600 camera or $1,500. Like add another lens on top of it, that's a $2,500, right? Same thing as Sony a7 III. In my personal experience and the R&D that I've done so far, I have kind of now moved towards Sony than the Nikon. So that's why I recommended this camera versus the other one. So please feel free to use this. The reason I'm recommending you this because I've used Sony. I've been using the Sony for past month right now. So I definitely recommend that. Or if you have more budget, or if you have a more rental budget, go with this A1, because this is your top of the line camera where you can actually film all the way up to 8K, right? So again, I want to go over all these camera options and all these different settings and all these different tools that you can use when it comes to such as a tripod and mics and the lighting. I already talked about it in the previous video. So if you guys want to watch this video a couple of times just to kind of get a good gauge on like, hey, what camera I want to get, whether I want to buy it or rent it, make a wise decision. And again, if you don't want to get the camera, there's always that camera app available, right? And I've done avatars using that, so it works. So you're not stuck to buying the camera or renting the camera. Just use your phone. So this is all I wanted to cover in this video, and I'll see you on the next one.